Today is June 16th, 2008. I am Cassie Potasic, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project, North Hazen, North Dakota. Can you please tell me your full name?
Elden David John Zuern.
When and where were you born?
I was born in Hazen, May 29th, 1928.
Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
Yes, I guess I have. My mother weighed less than 100 pounds, and she was barely 5 feet tall, and I weighed in at 9.5 when I was born, and did such a miserable job on her that they knew they would never have any more children. So I'm the only child.
All right. Do you know, was there a midwife or a doctor present?
I believe it was a doctor.
All right. Can you please share some of your earliest memories with us?
Oh, I remember when I was 3 years old. We lived on a farm a mile away from here. I grew up there. And my grandfather was still alive at that time. He died shortly later. But he was alive at that time. And I still remember him and remember some of the crazy things that happened there. One time he was feeding the chickens, and he bent over to kind of take some grain out of the pail, and one of our rams kind of took a pot shot at him and kind of spilled him on the ground. The other time, my dad was gone. I'm not sure where he was, but I know that he had gone someplace, but he had left the car at home. And the car was in the car shed. My grandfather said that he would like to go somewhere. And so he was going over to the car shed and asked me to go along, and he wanted to start the car, but he didn't know where the ignition switch was, because it was a 1928 Chevy and the ignition switch was underneath the dashboard. So I showed him where the ignition switch was, and he turned it on and turned on the engine and backed the car out of the car shed, hit a pole with the back bumper and kind of tore the back bumper off, or one side of the back bumper. He immediately put the car back in the shed and said, "Don't tell your dad when he comes home." Well, of course, when Dad come home, he was barely on the yard when I was out there telling him about what Grandpa had done. And so that was one of the experiences I remember in my early childhood.
All right. What was your grandfather's name?
John, Sr.
Was this your paternal grandfather?
That was my paternal grandfather, John Zuern, Sr. Actually, his name was Johann, but they all started calling him John by the time I grew up.
Right. Do you know where he was born?
He was born, I believe, in Brackdorf, Bessarabia. In fact, I'm sure he was.
And when did he come over to the United States?
1986, or 1896, I'm sorry. And his father and mother brought their children over from, there were several children, I'm not sure exactly how many right now, and they brought them over from Russia and settled in Tyndall, South Dakota. And then my great-grandfather died in Tyndall in 1900, and we've never been able to find his grave. But my great-grandmother and the family came up to Hazen here, and they homesteaded here. My grandfather homesteaded a mile west of here, and my great-grandmother also homesteaded about 2 or 3 miles northwest of here.
Did Did you ever hear any stories about when they came over?
No, I really didn't. I know they had a trip up from Tyndall. Nothing about the trip to America, but I know they came up from Tyndall and
All right. Did you know your grandmother?
no, my grandmother died very early as a young person. I think it was shortly after my father was born, and that was 1902 when he was born.
Did you ever hear any stories about her?
Not really. Uh, I guess she was gone so long that there just wasn't much said about her.
Okay. Did you know your maternal grandparents?
Yes, uh, that was John and Maria Dahlman. They lived in Zap, and they homesteaded northwest of Zap. I'm not sure when, but then after they homesteaded for a while, they uh, moved into Golden Valley, and my grandfather worked there for a while and earned some money, and then he bought another farm that was a couple of miles away from where he homesteaded, and built a nice farm there. In fact, he built one of the round roof or a semi-round roof barns that was just enormous out on the farm there. And they lived there for a lot of years. And then my grandmother died, oh, I don't know, it must have been in the 40s or 50s. And then my grandfather moved out to California to live with his daughter out there.
Did you ever stay with them when you were growing up?
No, I didn't. Visited them a lot, but never stayed there.
What kind of people were they?
They were German, Russian people. They spoke the High German language. My dad and his family spoke the Schwäbisch German, so I got some High German from them and from my mother. And they were just average people, hardworking. My grandfather was hardworking, and he developed a hernia early in life, and so he never had an operation until he was fairly old, and always used a small fork and things like that, so he wouldn't have to lift too hard, but he worked, really worked hard.
Right. What are some of your favorite memories of your maternal grandparents?
Oh, we used to go and visit them and enjoyed them. He was more a rancher than he was a farmer. He did some farming, but mostly was ranching. And so I enjoyed going out there and seeing the cattle and seeing the horses. And then when I was in my very early teens, he gave me a saddle horse that they had retired from the farm out there. The saddle horse was really too old for them to use anymore as on the ranching program. So he gave me that horse, and I had her for a number of years, and really felt very proud and happy to have a riding horse of my own. We had horses on the farm, but we didn't have any riding horses at that time. So I guess those are primarily the things I remember. We just visited them and had a good time.
Do you have any memories of your grandmother?
My
Maternal grandmother?
maternal grandmother? Oh, yes. Yeah, she died after I was growing up, so I have memories of her, yes. Nothing spectacular. She was just one of those good old German-Russian women that took care of the house and cooked good meals. And nothing, spectacular outside of that.
Do you remember her funeral?
No, her funeral, I wasn't around at the time. I was down in Oklahoma during the time she was buried. And so I wasn't at the funeral. But one interesting thing about her is that when they lived in Golden Valley, her husband wanted to move back on the farm. And she says, well, I'm not going to move back on the farm unless I have a new house. And so he built a new house for her on the farm, and they moved back on the farm.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to share about either sets of grandparents?
I don't think so. My grandfather died when I was, I guess, about 3.5 years old. And I remember his death. He died in our home. And I remember the funeral. And at that time, they had the visiting hours in the home. And so he was in our living room in the house when he was in the casket, and people would come and visit. And so I remember that.
Right. When you were growing up, were you close to any aunts and uncles?
Yes, I was fairly close to all of my aunts and uncles. My dad's oldest brother, who was John, lived just a mile east of us. And I went to school a half a mile south of his place on a country school. So a lot of times I would walk right through his yard to go to school. And he did a lot of mechanic work. He repaired all of his own machinery and repaired ours as well. So my dad would come up and help him, and they would work in the shop. And as I came home from school, I would stop in for maybe an hour or two and watch them work on the machinery and on the vehicles. And it really was a very interesting and also good time for me to just kind of watch them work and pick up the little things, understand how vehicles worked and so on. So that was a very good experience. One of my other uncles lived a mile south, and even though I didn't get to see him as much, we were still very close to each other. The other uncle lived another mile further south, and I saw him a lot too. And then my aunt lived a mile and a half southwest of our place. So the whole family was in a fairly close area, and we got to know each other very well. My aunt was married to a fellow that was very friendly with my dad, and they had a lot to do with each other. But he died at the age of 37, I believe it was. I think it was around 1937. So he died as a fairly young man.
All right. These were your paternal aunts and
Yes.
uncles? Did you know any on your mother's side?
Yes. I knew both my aunt and my uncle. In fact, my uncle just died last year here in Beulah. And he was also a rancher. He was on the farm that my grandfather had built up, and he farmed there and ranched there for many years. And we used to go out and visit him and his wife. In fact, I was the best man at their wedding when they got married, and I was, I think, only 16 or 17 years old at the time. But we used to visit them quite a bit. Although one of the things that kind of hindered my relationship with my aunts and uncles is that actually from about 1944 on, I was out of the area for 50 years, except for some time in the summer when I would come back. And so I didn't have that close relationship all year long after I left high school, but until I left high school. And then my mother's sister, my aunt, married a fellow from California. And so they moved out to California. He was a contractor, a house builder, and did all kinds of woodwork and so on. So they lived out there for, well, until she died, and he died later on. And so we went and visited them once in a while, and they came and would visit us. And when we were in Quincy, Massachusetts, they came and visited a couple of times, and he redid our kitchen cabinets and put all kinds of drawers and things in them. They were kind of people that you didn't quite know what to expect from them. And so one day they just showed up and said, you know, we're going to visit you. And that was 4,000 miles away from California. And my wife said, well, how long are you going to stay? And he said, well, that depends upon how we get along. This was around the middle of October or the beginning of October. And finally, the week before Thanksgiving, they said, we're going to have to leave because we promised our daughter in New Mexico that we would be there for Thanksgiving, so we're going to have to leave. So they were with us, I think, about 6 weeks or something like that, and had a great time with each other. It worked out so well. But and he really meant it, that if we didn't get along, they were going to leave. But we got along very well. So I didn't get to her funeral either because we were 4,000 miles away at the time.
All right. When you were growing up, did you have a favorite aunt or uncle?
I don't really think so. They were all we just had good relationships with all of them, so I can't really say. When I went to high school, I stayed with my aunt, my dad's sister, in Hazen during the winter months when it was too cold and too unpredictable as far as travel was concerned. So I would stay with her and board there, live there while going to high school. And come back on weekends and stay there for the best part of the week. We got along well with each other.
And what was her name?
Elizabeth. Called her Lizzie, Aunt Lizzie.
All right. Do you have a lot of cousins?
Not very many. I have one cousin that lives just a half a mile south from here that we see a lot. He's 9 years older than I am. And of course, when I went to school, saw him a lot. Grade school, which was half a mile south of his farm. And one of my cousins lived about a quarter mile east of here, and she's in the care center right now. Got in there last year, and of course I didn't know them too well until the last 6 years or so when we moved back here and got to know them a little better. Knew her as I was growing up, but didn't really, have that much to do with each other. And then there was another cousin of that family, and she was the youngest one, and she died in 1971. So I just got to know her as I was growing up, and then after that, we really never saw each other much. Three of my other cousins on my father's side were adopted by my two uncles. Aunt Lizzie had one child that died shortly after birth. The adopted ones I got to know until I got through high school. They were younger than I am. And one of my cousins, I was the best man at his wedding in Grand Forks, and he also studied for the ministry and never got ordained because he promised the dean that he wasn't going to get ordained. He had a little problem with the dean, and I think it's a mistake. I think he should have got ordained. But then he went on to law school and became a lawyer and served the state of North Dakota for many years in the prison system and in the capital and so on. And right now he's interim preaching in Hawaii. So he'll be there for a few more months and then be back again. Their son lives in Hawaii, so they kind of have a little relationship there. On my mother's side, I really never got to know my cousins that well because they're quite a bit younger. And by that time I was through high school and didn't get to know them that well, but got to know them after we kind of moved back here more. And one of them lives on the farm where my mother grew up. And one of them is, he and his wife are veterinarians in Beulah here, so I see them every now and then. And one of them lives in Alaska, and they come back every summer, and so we get together during the summer months. But I get along well with my cousins.
Do you have any memories of them when you were growing up? Any times when you got together?
Well, with my cousin close by here, of course, I have a lot of memories because we used to be together quite a lot. And he had a motorcycle, and I used to ride with him on the motorcycle. And one of the crazy things about it is that, of course, the old motorcycles had magnetos on them, so when they missed out, he would always ask me to touch the spark plug and see which one was missing. And of course, that's quite a shock when it isn't missing, and you get that shock from the magneto. And we used to go out riding together and things of that nature. And then when I was a junior in high school, I believe, I got a motorcycle of my own, a Harley, small Harley. And so he kind of helped me keep that in shape, and it was kind of nice to. And then in 1976, he and his wife and I and one of my school friends from grade school and high school took a motorcycle trip down to the Black Hills. And my dad and my wife and Herb's wife were in a car, and they would follow us most of the time. Sometimes they'd ride on the cycles. But so we took a nice tour down through the hills, and it was really nice, except that back in '76, people weren't that used to motorcycles. And we had a couple of more friends that joined us from south of the Black Hills there. And so there were 5 motorcycles and a car. And we'd drive down the road, and the people would see us coming, and they would pull off the road to let us go by because they thought we were a motorcycle gang and they didn't want to tangle with us. So it was kind of interesting. So, but
All right.
I've owned a motorcycle practically, for the last 20 years, I guess. And then I just sold my Harley last year because my eyesight was not that good anymore and I didn't feel that comfortable on it. But if you've ever owned a Harley, you know how hard it is to part with them. So my first and last bikes were Harleys.
All right. a little bit about some of your extended family, but let's talk about your parents a little bit. Can you tell me about your father?
I was blessed with a very wonderful father. Um, I think that he and my mother were kind of unusual as far as German-Russian parents were concerned, or family was concerned. Um, they were very loving. I always knew that I was loved more than practically anything else in the world by my parents. Uh, they had discipline, and my father had fairly strict discipline. When I got out of line, I got my discipline, but he was very understanding and would always listen to my side of the story before I got any discipline. And they would hug and kiss, and it was just unusual, I think, at that time, for parents to act that way. And it made it so much easier for me uh, later going into the ministry uh, to understand the love of God, because I saw it reflected in my parents. And unfortunately, my mother died when I was 14. And but I was a junior in high school at that time, and so I was only home for another year, and then I went off to college. And even at that time, I felt that I was fairly mature for my age. I guess I started school when I was young, and I took a couple of grades in one year, and so I wound up graduating just a few days before my 16th birthday from high school. And I missed her, but of course I missed my dad too when I was at college. But I've always felt that their upbringing made such a difference in my life, especially when I was in college and I was so young, a couple of years younger than most other kids in college. And I never really strayed from what the good path or what I knew was right. I remember one time when uh, I had taken the car and I'd taken some of my friends on a little tour. They were just building the railroad out to the Truex mine out here, about a mile east of here. And I drove around there to try to show them, how things were going. And I hit a rail with the car, with a tire, and blew the tire. It was just a new tire that we had gotten, and that was during the war years when you couldn't get tires, and you waited for a new tire for I don't know how long, and we just gotten the new tire. And I hated to come home because I thought my dad was really going to be pretty angry about it. So I told him about it when I got home, and he says, well, that's one of those things that happens. And he didn't get angry, he didn't scold me, he just took it as part of life. And those are the kinds of things that I think really mold a person's life, because that kind of love and understanding, I think, was so meaningful. And then my dad got remarried 3 months before Norma and I got married. And he called me up while I was at college, and he said, what do you think about my getting married? And I said, well, Dad, you're always welcome to live with us, but or with me. But if you think you have found a person that you can be happy with, that's fine with me. And he said, well, there's one other problem. She's got a couple of children. One's 4 and one's 6. And of course, I was 17 or 18 at the time. And I said, well, Dad, if you can be a dad to them like you have been to me, you will have fulfilled your purpose in life twice. And he was. He was just as good a dad to them as he was to me.
Is there anything anything else you'd like to share with us about your father?
My dad was very active in church. Uh, the church that I attended had a lot of problems. They argued a lot about the German and English language and the use of the church. And he was always one of the people that would support the minister and be on his side, if at all possible, unless he really felt the minister was off key. But he was very supportive. He sang in the choir. My mother played the piano for the services, and Dad would also read the sermons on the Sundays when the minister wasn't there. The minister was there once in 3 weeks, so there were always 2 Sundays in between. And some of his brothers read the sermons as well, but after a while, he read the sermons most of the time. And the reason was primarily because he could read the German quickly, and he read the sermons much faster than his brothers did. And so the people wanted him to read, so instead of sitting there for 45 minutes or so, they were generally out maybe, or the sermon was maybe about 20, 30 minutes long. And so they really wanted him to do it, and he did. So he was active. His faith was a very strong faith. It was not radical. It was a conservative faith, I guess, but it was one that he lived. It wasn't just talking about it. It was one that was reflected in his life. And I don't know what else I can say about him except that he was such a great guy.
Great. Can you tell us when, where, and how he died?
He died here in Hazen at the hospital. He had gone into the hospital about a week before, and the job I was working at the time, they had a hard time reaching me because of the telephone system and so on. And they finally reached me and told me that he had had a heart attack and he was in the hospital and he was doing okay. And I couldn't believe it, because 3 of my uncles on his brothers had all died of heart attacks instantly. They had never made it to the hospital or doctor or anything else. They just had a heart attack and they were gone. So when they said he was okay, I just couldn't hardly believe it. And then a week later, they called me again, and the doctor got through to me immediately, which was kind of unusual. And they said, "Your dad is having another heart attack, and we want to know whether we should use other means to keep him alive, or whether we should just let him go." And I said, I know that he would want to die without all the other paraphernalia and so on, so just let him go. And they did. And then he died shortly before Christmas. And of course I was serving a church out in Massachusetts, but my church people said, "You go and take as much time as you need and take care of things back home." So they took the whole Christmas season, and we stayed here till after New Year's. But I knew what his wishes were, and I just followed that. I was thankful that we had talked about it, and I knew just what he wanted.
Right. Can you tell me a little bit about your mother?
My mother was just about as unusual as my father. She had grown up in the home where education was kind of pushed and seemed important, which in many German Russian families at that time was not. She had books, she had a library, and she encouraged me to read. Even before I started school at 5 years old, they taught me numbers and different things. taught me the English language so that when I went to school I could speak English as well as the German. And she just pushed education and always made it feel like it was important to keep up to date with things. And so I think I got my zeal for education from her. And I know when I started high school, one of my aunts says, "Why do you want to go to high school? You don't need to go to high school to farm." And I said, "I want to go to high school." And then when I finished high school and started going to college, she says, "Why do you want to go to college?" And of course, at that time, I decided to enter the ministry. And so I just told her that I, needed to go. But education with most of the people at that time was not that important, or didn't seem to be that important. But it was to my mother. And was always, she helped my dad all the time, even drove tractor and things like that. She was not a strong person and later developed a bad heart, and so she couldn't do all the work. So I started driving tractor and truck and car when I was 6 years old, because I kind of had to take her place. And I was the only child. We couldn't afford a hired person, and so I was doing a lot of the work. But it was kind of interesting because I started driving tractor one day when Dad hollered at Mom because the binder that he was pulling, the tractor was pulling the binder, and in a wet spot the wheel wouldn't operate the binder anymore, and he kind of got upset and he kind of hollered at her, which was very unusual for either one of them. And she got off the tractor and she says, "Okay, drive the tractor yourself." And so she came in the house, and he came to the house, and he asked me whether I thought maybe I could drive the tractor for him. And that's how I got started driving the tractor. And then he modified the tractor so that I could manipulate the clutch and the shift handle and stuff like that. And from there on, I was one of the main helpers on the farm. And that too, I think, is so important for youngsters, because I never felt that I was being abused or used. I always felt that if I could help, it was such a privilege to be one of the members of the family that could be beneficial to the farm. And so that, I think that's so important in kids' lives, which today I think is much harder to achieve, because there aren't that many jobs to do that are meaningful. You take out the garbage and you do this or do that, but when you start farming, that is a very meaningful position. Outside of that, my mother was a very loving person too, and I think the affection that my father and mother showed to each other was so important in my life, because it made me a much more sensitive person to people's feelings. And I think that was a real part of my ministry, is that I can seem to be able to respond to people's feelings and understand and have empathy with them.
All right. Can you tell me when, where, and how she died?
She contracted pneumonia. And of course, back in the 40s, they didn't have the antibiotics that they have now. And so it was a very difficult thing with her heart condition to fight the pneumonia. And again, it was kind of drastic, I guess, that one afternoon the doctor told my dad and I that the pneumonia had broken and she ought to be okay. And then later that evening, early evening, her heart gave out, and the doctor came and said, sorry, but we can't save her anymore. So we kind of had a real concern for I don't know how many days that she wasn't going to make it. And then we got the news that we thought she was going to be fine, and then shortly thereafter she died. So it was an emotional, very emotional experience for me. But again, I think I was fairly mature so that I could take it into my everyday life and really, and my faith, feeling that God would take care of her no matter what, and take care of us no matter what, was one of the basic beliefs that we had, and that helped me a lot. And of course, I had a good relationship with my dad, and that made things a lot better too. But I still remember her lying in state at the house and people being there, and
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your parents?
well, I think that pretty much covers it.
All right. Well, you mentioned having to start helping when you were 6 years old. What were some of the things you did?
Well, I drove the tractor for Dad when he was doing the bindering, and also would drive the horses when we were headering. I drove the horses for the header box, which probably doesn't mean much to young people today. I don't know whether they know what a header box is or what even headering is. But it's cutting the grain. We had 4 horses on the header that would cut the grain, and then there was an elevator that would take the grain up into a box on a wagon, a big box. And my mom would be up there kind of shuffling the grain around, and so that we could fill the box. And I would drive the team of horses that pulled the wagon. And so that was part of my job. And then later on, when we changed hooked the tractor up to the header, I was driving the tractor for that. And I don't know how old I was at that time. I was probably 9, 10 years old. And when I was about 14, I guess my dad got a combine, and I started running the combine part of the time as well. So it was, and then I guess I should say that in the early 30s, in late 30s, around 36, 37, of course the grain was so poor around here, the wheat was so poor, that we didn't harvest that much. But Dad would combine, and I would drive the Model T truck back and forth from the field to the granary, and then I would unload the granary. And I was 8, 9 years old at that time. So just about anything that I needed to do or could do, I did. And again, it was that feeling that I was such a valuable asset to the farming industry.
What were some of your other chores when you were growing up?
We did milk some cows, and I would milk a little bit, but I was never very good at that. Somehow or other, my hands, I would get cramps in my hands, and I would be able to milk more than about 1 cow, but we only milked about 6 or 7, so it wasn't that bad. And I would feed some of the stock, and we had sheep, and we had pigs, and we had chickens, and turkeys, and geese, ducks, and I would help feed those and kind of gather the eggs and just do most anything that people would need to do on the farm. I enjoyed the animals. They were always, I always liked to work with them and be with them. I don't know what else I really did.
Did you ever have to help with any inside chores?
In the house, no, not really.
No dishes or laundry?
No dishes or laundry, no. That my mother took care of that pretty much. I always enjoyed the butchering days. One day a year we would butcher 4 hogs and a beef, a steer. And that was the only day of the year that I could miss school without being sick. Butchering day would start about 5 o'clock in the morning and run to midnight at night. And I would be able to stay home and watch them butcher the animals, dress out the animals, cut up the meat and grind the meat, make sausage. From morning to night it was an operation that finished up with all the things taken care of and sausage ready for the smokehouse and everything else.
Do you remember how they made sausage?
Well, we would grind the meat and mix it and put seasoning into it, some sugar and some salt and some pepper, and I don't know what else they put into it. And then they would, we had a sausage stuffer that we would have the casings, and you would put the casings on the stuffer, and then you would turn the wheel or the crank, and the sausage would come out, and you'd make the sausage, fill the casings with the sausage. And it was interesting experience, but I guess not one that most people know about today. We wasted very little meat on the animals that we had. My mother would even cook the brains from the hogs and the beef. Of course, the livers and heart and all that was used mostly in the sausage. We didn't use the kidneys. Those are one of the things we didn't use. And some people did, but we didn't. And then we also had the chickens that we would butcher, and turkeys, geese. The geese and ducks, we mostly smoked the meat on that. We had a nice little smokehouse and smoked the hams and the bacon and the sausage, as well as the breasts and legs of the geese and ducks. Back then there weren't any refrigerators, so you had to either cure it and smoke it or else can it. And we never had refrigeration on the farm when I was home. If we wanted to keep cream or milk for any length of time, a couple of days or so, we would hang them down into the well. Our well was about 12 feet deep, and of course the water was cold down there, and we would hang them down into the well and keep them fairly cool that way. And then we could use them a couple of days later. But there was no refrigeration. We didn't have an ice box. We didn't have any ice. And so that was one of the things that they improvised. We had a well right on the farm. We had one in the house that we had a hand pump up in the kitchen, and so we could have water in the kitchen just by pumping. And then we had a windmill out in the yard next to what was the old sod house. Uh, in fact, Dad built that. There was another well earlier, but I remember building the well that is there now and that we used for many, many years. And there's a windmill on it. And I devised a way of putting a 30-gallon tank on top of the little addition, the walkway to the sod house there, and put a 30-gallon tank on top of it and ran the water from the well through with the windmill into that tank. And so in the summertime, we had our own little shower. Go into that little entryway, and we'd have nice warm water from the sun during the day. And when we came home from the field at night, all dirty and dusty, we could take a shower. And that was a privilege that a lot of people didn't have.
All right. Can you tell me a little bit about the house that you grew up in?
The house that I grew up in was a 3-bedroom house that had 3 bedrooms upstairs. It was a 2-story house with a full basement underneath. And the basement was concrete and concrete floor in it. I think the house was built in the late 20s sometime, at least before I was born. And had the other, it had one storeroom upstairs also that we used for just storage, different things. And the main floor had the kitchen and dining room and living room and then a couple of closets. Oh, wait a minute, there was 1 bedroom downstairs as well. So my grandfather used the downstairs bedroom as long as he was alive. And it was heated with a coal furnace that had 1 main opening, and then there were registers in the floor above that would let a little heat go upstairs. And it was central heating, but it only heated pretty much in one area. So, and we would get the coal from my aunt's place. They used to mine coal from the hills about a mile away from our home. And every fall we would go over there, and they would, most of my uncles would get together and we'd all mine coal and truck it home and store it till we needed it in the wintertime. No running water, but we were fortunate that we had the pump in the kitchen and we had water in the kitchen all year long. No electric lights. We used kerosene lamps most of the time. We had also had a gasoline lantern that was much brighter than the kerosene ones. But then as I got into high school, I thought maybe it would be nice to have electric lights in my room, in my bedroom. So I hooked up 3 batteries that were large 2-volt batteries to a wind charger that we had on top of that, what we used, the old sod house that we used as a car shed and shop. And I hooked up those batteries to that charger, and then I ran wires from that building over to the house and hooked up some car bulbs, car headlight bulbs in my bedroom so that I could have electric lights in my room and do some reading with those, which was a lot nicer than the kerosene lamps. So you try to figure out things that make life a little easier even those times. I guess that also shows that my dad was very accepting and let me do things that weren't wrong, that were okay, even though they may not have been the usual kinds of things that people did.
Right. Did your family have a telephone?
Yes, we had a telephone. That's one of the conveniences we had. It was one of those old wood boxes on the wall that was hooked up to a party line. I don't know how many people were on the line. There probably were about 30 or 20, 30, something like that. And each one would have a different ring. And you would turn a little handle on the box to ring. And if you turn the handle 3 or 4 times, that was called a long ring. And if you turn the handle about once, that was a short one. And I remember that our ring was 5 short rings. So whenever we got 5 short rings, we would answer the phone. And of course, when you heard the telephone ring, you could also pick up the receiver and listen in to everybody else's conversation too.
Right. Did your family have a radio when you were growing up?
We got a radio. I can't remember exactly what year it was. It was fairly early. It was, again, we didn't have electricity, so it was a battery radio. But it was one of the old big black boxes with several batteries to it. And I think we were one of the first people around here to have the radio. And we enjoyed listening to the radio programs that were on the stations. Of course, the long winter nights sometimes were nice to. It was nice to be able to listen to some programs, and I'm trying to remember some of them, and I can't think of them right now. There was some something Armstrong, and a few of the other programs that we generally listened to. The reception wasn't that great, but we generally picked up Bismarck.
All right. When you were growing up, do you always remember your family having a car?
Yes. We had a 1928 Chevy sedan, and had that till I think about 1934 or something like that, maybe 30. No, it was later than that, I think. And then we got a 32 Ford V8 sedan, and that was a car for until 1946, when Dad bought a new Ford, and the cost of that new Ford I still remember, and that was a sedan as well. And that was $1,265. That was right after the war. That V8, Ford V8 that Dad had, he was always wanting to be able to drive through snow and so on. And he did, because he put larger tires on the car, on the back, and then instead of just regular chains, he put extra links into the chains, so they had twice as many links as the regular chains. And we would go through snowbanks that other people wouldn't even try. And of course, back then the roads were not like they are today. They were pretty level with the ground. And so the snowbanks, a lot of the roads were blocked and you wouldn't be able to drive on them. So we would drive through the fields and find a way to get into town that way. We had 7 miles to go, and we'd go through the fields and find a way that the snow wasn't too deep and get to town that way.
Did you ever get snowed in during the winter?
Yes, we got snowed in a few times too. When we'd be snowed in for several days. I don't know whether it was a week or not. Maybe it could have been as much as a week, maybe. But back in the 30s and 40s, I remember that there were snowstorms that were, the snow piles would be like 12, 15 feet high, and you could walk right onto the roof of a building many times just from the snow. And I haven't really seen that much snow in the latter years. I know since we retired here 6 years ago, and of course you haven't seen anything like that. But I remember one time when I was in college, and I came home for Christmas vacation, and I was driving a little 39 Studebaker coupe, and I went to college in Yankton, South Dakota, and seminary there, and all the way from Aberdeen to Bismarck or to Jamestown, I drove in slush, and it was just terrible driving. And from Jamestown to Bismarck, it was slush and snow. And so I called up my dad, or tried to call my dad from Bismarck, because I wasn't sure that I could make it the rest of the way home, even though it was only 70-some miles. And my dad wasn't there, but my cousin answered the phone. And she says, well, let me look how much snow we've got. So she went out and she looked, and she says, oh, we've got about 2 inches. And I said, okay, I'll be on my way home. Well, I got through Mandan, and just west of Mandan, I hit a snowbank that really wasn't that much, but my car died out right in the middle of the snowbank. It got wet and it just died out and stopped, and I couldn't get it started. But there was a farm right, within 1/8 of a mile or so from where it stopped. So I walked over, and it was blowing, snowing, and cold. This was at night. And I walked over to the farm, and I again tried to call my dad, and he was there at that time, and he says, thank God you're safe. We've got about 18 inches of snow out here. And so we left the car the farmer pulled me in to his yard with a team of horses, I guess it was. Or maybe it was, I guess it was a team of horses. And left the car there. And then the next day, I caught the train from Mandan to Hazen. And it was, I think, 2 or 3 days before we could get the car home. Some of the roads between Mandan and here, there were 20-foot drifts on the road. And I always feel that if I'd been hit one of those in that middle of the night where there weren't any farmers around or anything, I probably wouldn't be here today. So a few days later, we at least went down and got the car. But it took several days for that road to be opened up. So there were snowstorms, and there was lots of snow at times. Yeah.
What else do you remember about winters when you were growing up?
Sometimes it got pretty cold. I remember walking to school, and I had about 6 blocks to go walk to school. And one morning it was 42 below. And it seemed that we had colder weather back in the 40s, early 40s, than what has been since. But outside of that, when we were living on the farm before I went to high school, we would go to church. We just about went to church every Sunday if it was at all possible. And during the winter times, a lot of times we would take a bobsled and a couple of horses, and we would go to church in town that way. And we would generally stop by my uncle's place, which is up here, and pick them up, and then the 2 of the families would both go to church on the bobsled. And we would cover the bobsled with blankets or things, and scoot in underneath and try to keep warm till we got to church. And then I remember one time we started out and the horses got stuck in the snow. The snow was so high that the horses couldn't pull the sled. And so Dad had to unhitch the horses and try to get them out of the snowbank, and we didn't get to church that Sunday. So otherwise, I guess winters were winters, and we just lived through them, took them as they came. Most of the time, there was quite a bit of snow. One of the things that I kind of enjoyed doing, of course, I got some ice skates too when I was in high school, and so there was a dam about 4 miles southeast of us that we would skate on. But we would also take our cars and go down onto the ice and do twirlies on the ice. And it was always kind of see who could do the most twirlies, get a couple of people together with their cars. And never had any accidents or never had any problems with it, but I guess we just knew how to do it and were careful and just had a lot of fun.
All right. Then, can you tell us a little bit about what spring was like when you were growing up?
Well, spring generally was a very nice time of year when we would get some rain, and most of the time we got some rain at least, and we would plant the crops. Again, I helped out on the farm. One year I remember going to high school and one of my teachers let me cut one of my classes because I had taken 2 years of Latin in my freshman and sophomore year. And so that made English so easy for me that English grammar just came like eating ice cream. And so she let me cut the classes in one class in the afternoon, and I would make up the work, do the homework. And I had the motorcycle at that time. So I would get up in the morning and go out and plow the field for a while. Then I'd take the motorcycle and run into town. And then at 2:30, I'd get on the motorcycle and come back home and plow some more fields. So that was part of the springtime. And of course, seeding was always part of the springtime, what we did in the spring. And it was always a pleasurable time of the year. I've always been thankful and enjoyed the rain and the growing of things. We would also plant a garden. We had a large garden. And during the Depression, of course, you couldn't hardly, well, we didn't have any money, so we couldn't hardly buy anything. What little money we had from the cream and eggs from the chickens, and we would buy sugar and flour and just the basic ingredients that we needed to make bread and maybe buy some coffee. And once in a while we'd have a treat and buy a nickel candy bar like a Hershey bar and have some of those. We'd eat one piece at a time and space it out over a long time. But the garden was very helpful in that we would raise all kinds of vegetables and lots of potatoes, and that would give us food for a good part of the year. Outside of that, spring was, birds would come back and you'd listen to the birds, and of course we also had some chokecherry trees, and we would go and pick chokecherries, and Mom would make jelly, and go out and pick some juneberries along the creeks, and she'd make juneberry pie. We used to have some real big cottonwood trees between the road and the farm place. And it was always nice to see the birds and hear the birds in the trees there. When they built a better road back in the 40s, I think it was, then they took all the trees out because they widened the road enough to where the trees were in where they wanted to build a road. And so we lost all the trees, chokecherry trees and the cottonwood trees.
All right. And can you tell us about summer?
Summer was hot. And in the summertime, I don't know what we really did in the summertime. There was some haying to do and things of that nature, but it wasn't such a busy time. The spring and the fall were the busy times, and so the summer we would hoe the garden and keep the weeds out of the garden, things of that nature, and do the haying and put up hay for the winter. Can't really remember that we did a lot of other things in the summertime, except that I know sometimes it was very, very hot. And of course, when we started harvesting in the fall, it sometimes was very hot at those times too. So.
Do you want to tell us about fall?
Fall was a very busy time because even though we didn't get a lot of grain from the fields, it still had to be cut and of course when we first did the bindering and the headering, that was a slow process and it took a lot of time. And excuse me, but it was always a time when we counted God's blessings, even though there weren't that many bushels to be had. And then, of course, later on when we got the combine, then we would use that, and it was a little quicker and a little easier, but it was still fairly a lot of work. My dad only had a small 8-foot combine that ran off of the power takeoff of a tractor. So it didn't have, at that time he didn't have, later on he had a larger combine, but at that time he didn't. While I was around, that was the only combine we had. And so took a long time to harvest a field with 8-foot combine, but we made it. And then after that, it was pretty much getting soaked in for the winter, and so haul coal, mine coal, put that in, as I mentioned before. Then, of course, he went back to school, and when I was in grade school, I generally walked to school and walked home. High school was a little later, but in the fall, either Dad would drive me, or in the wintertime I'd stay in town. And then later on, when I got the motorcycle, I would drive back and forth on the motorcycle most of the time.